Welcome to this retrospective / review for the video game Neutopia. Now, as you see in the background here, I'm going to have the game, some gameplay footage I did earlier. When I was playing it, I was trying to get all the achievements through the Retro Achievements website, and there's one achievement for beating the game without the fire wand. So that's what I'm trying to do here in the background, is play with just the sword, which I found out is not as easy as you would think. But that being the case, I just want to kind of give you some of my brief thoughts on the game and just how I feel about it, basically. So, in some areas, there's not a lot of reviews for the game out here. It's, I wouldn't call it super obscure, but it's a fairly obscure title, to be fair. And I would say that a lot of the criticism for this game is the fact that it is a unashamed Zelda clone. And there's obviously some truth to that, to say the least. It definitely 100% is a Zelda clone, but I don't truly feel that is a negative thing, especially if you look at the time period that this game came out. That was pretty much par for the course, because I think originally the game was came out in 1989 in Japan. It came out a little bit later here in North America, but Nintendo still had a lot of third-party companies locked down. So for these consoles like the Genesis and the TurboGrafx to distinguish themselves, they kind of had to make a lot of clone games. So from that perspective, yes, this game is very, very similar to The Legend of Zelda, but I don't necessarily view that as a negative aspect, because it does seem to be that's one of the biggest negative mentions about the game, is that it is an unabashed Zelda clone. Personally, not a big deal as far as I'm concerned, but that does seem to be the overriding sentiment in regards to the game. Now, I think that the game itself actually does look good. The graphics are actually very good, especially for a fairly early TurboGrafx game. It's, obviously I think later games, and especially CD-based games, look much better than this, but for an early TurboGrafx game, I think it looks very good. If you were to compare it side by side with The Legend of Zelda, obviously there'll be a lot of comparisons there, that this game does actually look a fairly decent bit better. Now, I also think the music itself is actually, and the sound effects are actually pretty good as well. I don't think it has, obviously, an iconic type soundtrack like the Zelda games on the NES, but it doesn't have a grating soundtrack either. It's good, it's acceptable. I mean, the tunes themselves they're definitely catchy, and some of them, like especially towards the end of the game, are actually quite good. But I don't think you could say it's on the same level of iconic as, say, the Zelda soundtrack. But that's it still doesn't take away from the fact that I do believe that the soundtrack is good in this game and definitely complements it. Sound effects, of course, they sound a lot like pretty much anything you would have heard in the first Zelda game, so very similar there. They get the job done. Control is something that is actually pretty good with the game as well. If there's anything that I think that this game could definitely be criticized for, it could be the controls, especially when using the sword. The sword, it doesn't have that same feel like in the original Legend of Zelda. It's very hard to sometimes get a beat on creatures with it. So one of the drawbacks to the game is, like, you see there's like a lot of these big sprites, like these creatures here that you see me fighting right now in the background. They're relatively easy to hit, but with the smaller creatures, you have to line up very precisely, which isn't something that you had to deal with too much with the first NES Zelda game, because it was kind of like the game itself was all like square based, for lack of better words. Like each little square was a grid, if you will, even though you're kind of moving along it. It seems like you're much more easily able to hit enemies with your sword in Legend of Zelda compared to this game. Now, having said that, though, this game does have the fire rod. It basically does alleviate some of that imprecision, as it were, because even the basic fire rod fireball is fairly big, so it's relatively easy to hit creatures with it. And initially I wasn't a big fan of the flames along the ground way of doing things with the fire rod, but it does grow on you after a while. It's an interesting play on the Zelda formula, as it were, because in the first Zelda game, if you have full health, you could throw your sword or shoot energy bolts, whatever you want to consider it as, if you have full health. Whereas in this game, you don't do that, but the more health you have, the better your fire rod is. And so that's a very interesting concept. I liked that concept. And it wasn't something that was, if you don't have full health, it's completely and totally, worthless. So from that perspective, that's actually a very nice feature that I appreciated for certain in this game. Obviously, I will admit that I did have the original gold cartridge on the NES way back in the day. So a lot of my comparison is going to be from my personal experience playing the first Zelda game, though I never played this one. I did purchase it on the Wii U when the Virtual Console was still a thing before that got shut down by Nintendo. So I do have that on my Wii U, but like a lot of those games, I would prefer to play them via emulator so I can get achievements. It just makes the game a lot better. It gives you something to shoot for other than just beating the game. So I like that aspect. But yes, if you were to compare this to Zelda, there's a lot of simulators. Bombs. They both have bombs. You have the rainbow drop, which is basically the equivalent of the ladder in Legend of Zelda. Well, the bell is unique. The bell in this is very unique. And like I said, the fire rod is also fairly unique, even though there was something very similar in Legend of Zelda, though it's not exactly the same here. Potions, that's all that's all the same, basically. Now, as far as bombing is concerned, like there is a little bit of visual stimulus or visual keys that you can see basically in the overworld to kind of give you some sort of idea of where you can bomb, and you're not just going around bombing everything you see blindly trying to hopefully find something. So from that perspective, this game is a little bit better from an exploration perspective than the first Zelda game, but in the dungeons or labyrinths, excuse me, a lot of the walls have no tells that you can bomb them. So it does kind of revert to a little bit of the just bomb everything to see if there's anything hidden behind here, especially in the 7th dungeon. The 7th dungeon, that was a very prominent feature of that labyrinth, to say the least. But it wasn't just the 7th labyrinth that did that. There was other ones that was a factor as well. But other than that, I think the game is there's not a huge need for a guide but there were a few areas where I did get a little bit stuck looking for things, and from that perspective, I did look up a map to kind of help me out, or even just forum posts from other people who had tried to find, like the monk in the sea sphere who gave vitality, for instance. It was really difficult to find that one, and it wasn't very obvious. But that was really about the only thing that I can truly think of off the top of my head where I just got lost and was like, okay, I give up at this point. So outside of that, basically, the game itself wasn't too guide heavy of a game. which there is some criticism of the original Legend of Zelda in the fact that it's very cryptic. So from that perspective, this game is not nearly as cryptic as the first Zelda, but I also didn't feel the first Zelda was too bad either from my own personal experience, but to each his own. Other than that, I think the game itself, it's a good game. I think it's it's one of those games that is next to impossible to come across nowadays, because the only place where it was prevalent before, like I said, was on the Wii U virtual console, and also the I think the Wii virtual console prior to that. So outside of those two platforms, they also had the TurboGrafx Mini that came out that I believe it was on, but I'm not exactly sure how viable of an option it is to come across that mini anymore. I know like a lot of these mini systems after their first production run, that was pretty much it. So it may be next to impossible at present to actually get your hands on a copy of this game legally. So do what you need to do if you want to play the game. Basically, I don't think anybody could truly judge you for that. But at the end of the day, I think this game, it's a good game. I think, like I said, there's some unfair criticism against it. The swordplay itself is probably, like I said, the weakest aspect of the game. But it's not very long. It's a fairly short game. Even with me, taking a lot of liberties, backtracking, and all that stuff, I think I still beat it in less than 10 hours, give or take. And so it's definitely a game that you can sit down and beat in around the 10-hour or less time period, I believe. It's and it's fun. Actually, for the most part, I didn't really get too frustrated while playing it. I mean, there were certain things that did frustrate me, like the clouds in the sky sphere, but outside of them, I mean, that frustration was extremely minor. Most of the bosses I was able to figure out pretty quickly. I may have been very sloppy the first time I beat them. I can admit that, but I did beat them. The only one I had to fight more than once was Dearth, the final boss. And so outside of that, it wasn't really that difficult of a game. It really isn't. So I would say it's a fairly easy game. Then again, most Zelda games in my eyes are also fairly easy, especially if you go around gathering up all the items and you actually play it with a very thorough mindset. I think that those types of games are fairly easy, at least in my personal opinion. So I don't think I would say that's something you could take away from this game as well, because in my view, I feel that most Zelda games are fairly easy as well. I'm looking forward to playing the second game to see what improvements they made for it. But this game is not bad. It's definitely fun to play, and like I said, I enjoy my time playing it, and I think it's definitely worth it if you're interested in Zelda type games and just experiencing the catalog of something like the TurboGrafx 16 that you may not have experienced growing up, like I didn't. And from that perspective, I think this game is actually a good time, to say the least. And I would probably give it a score of about 80%. I don't think it's I think it's above average. I really do. It's not an average game. I think it's above average because it does have that fun factor to it, and I think you'll enjoy playing it. But at the same time, it doesn't have the same iconic status as, say, Legend of Zelda, for obvious reasons. But it's definitely it's a good game to play. So yeah, 80% out of 100 would be what I would rank it. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the game Neutopia, and I'll just basically say thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.